Well, I really appreciate you doing this again.
My pleasure.
We had so many people who were so into your first interview here on Patreon, and I know a lot of them were excited about all the topics you suggested. Uh, so maybe we can make a whole series of them.
Sure, we can get to them by and by.
And you sent me some stuff that I can share as it comes up. Let me pull that up. Okay, cool. Yeah, let me actually go ahead and share this just in case I should forget about it later. Um, so these are links to further readings and illustrations of artifacts and other things, right? That's great.
Yeah, information about the various things I'm going to be talking about. I mean, just, I could, with screen sharing, I could pop all this stuff up there, but, logistically, that doesn't always work
Yeah.
with Zoom. So just stuff, if people want to either click on as I'm speaking or following up, it's all there. And they can find pretty much
Okay.
information for everything I'm going to be talking about.
Yeah, I'll put this in the chat too so people can go straight to it. There you go. Cool. Okay. Well, I have some questions people submitted. Of course, we can get to those as we get to them, or but first, why don't you give us kind of a précis about this topic, about what we know about pre-Christian religion in continental Europe.
Yeah. Um, well, we titled this Frankish Encounters with Paganism, and that puts us. I think probably the best place to start for today would be the conversion of Clovis in around 500 A.D. I mean, obviously, there's a whole. We could talk about paganism in the beginning in the first couple of centuries BC, first few centuries AD, as the Germanic tribes are impinging on the Roman world and stuff like that. But I think we should start with Clovis. The stuff that I know the most about is stuff that happens in the wake of the Frankish conversion in 500 AD and the long process of bringing Christianity to the Germanic peoples in the centuries after that conversion, all the way up to and including a little bit past what we talked about last time, which was the conversion of the Saxons under Charlemagne. So I suggest I have a few things I could say about the centuries prior, but we'll start in with Clovis. And then I thought we could talk about various things that show this kind of long period of incomplete Christianization, where lots of paganism is still hanging around in the countryside, in the East, and stuff like that. There's quite a bit there, with certain references to maybe Britannia, where the Frankish record is incomplete. And then we can take a closer look at one particular episode, namely the Donar oak in the early 8th century.
Which I assume is the reason for your background.
Yeah, yeah. I thought I would let the Donar oaks stay living in this during this talk.
Okay.
And then the Irminsul a little bit later, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the pagan reaction against Christianization. And that brings us up to then what we talked about last time. I can say a few things about the earlier time, although we might want to save that if we do a talk on Arminius and the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. That would be the time to bring that stuff in.
Okay. Yeah, and that was one of the topics that you suggested that
Yeah.
Patreon voted on. So yeah, let's probably put that off for its own talk.
Yeah.
That truly like Roman era stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we get to Clovis, I guess just a few preliminary remarks in general. One thing is about sources. We only really have Christian sources about this whole period. There's very little that survives that gives us the pagan perspective, right? Now, in the world of material culture, there are things like brooches and bracteates and some stones that show certain things. But in terms of written sources, there's nothing purely pagan that survives. Well, actually, maybe one thing, and that would be the Merseburg charms, right, which we'll talk about. That seems to be a pure pagan textual artifact, but it's the only one. There's no other source that is purely pagan in its point of view. Everything written about the Geismar oak or encounters with pagans in the countryside, it's all in Christian literature, and it talks about paganism from the Christian perspective, which is a very, very biased perspective, of course. Okay, so that always has to be, it's one of the most important things to keep in mind when you are talking about paganism at this time, is that it's always mediated through this very tendentious perspective. These Christians want to convert the pagans, right? And so very little good is said about paganism.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. So that's one thing. Now, just in terms of the conversion, if you're reading these sources, they will always say things like, well, you know, the conversion of these peoples to Christianity was inevitable because it was all part of God's plan, right? And in a certain way, although not from a religious perspective, in a certain way, there was an inevitability to the conversion of the Germanic peoples to Christianity beginning in about the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, so our period. There was a certain inevitability. And that inevitability was simply that the Roman, what Rome represented was just too attractive for these barbarian peoples coming down from the north. Christianization was an aspect of Romanization, all right? Rome represented something that all of these barbarian peoples wanted a part of. They wanted to become a part of that. Now there was a lot of aspects to that, right? For one thing, it was simply a matter of Rome had a high standard of living, and, you know, these Germanic warriors that came down, they loved the Roman lifestyle, right? The leisure, the wine, right? The ease and the enjoyment of Roman material culture was enormously attractive to the elites of the Germanic tribes that are moving down. The infrastructure, right? The education, the employment opportunities. I mean, Rome wanted these barbarians to staff the Roman army. Rome was very, very generous. This goes back to the first few centuries BC, right? Rome was very, very generous with its citizenship. Unlike all societies in the ancient world, the Romans were like, yeah, there's a pathway to citizenship here, right? And you go back as far as Caesar's Gallic Wars, written in the 1st century BC, right? And he's conquering Gaul, but some of the people he's dealing with are actually Roman citizens from Gallic tribes that are allied with Rome, right? Mm-hmm. Rome made it very, very easy for people to join up and become Roman. And at this point, Christianity began, you know, in the 400s, Christianity first became the unofficial religion in Rome. And then in the later 400s, the only acceptable religion, and all other religions were persecuted. And so if you wanted to be Roman, if you wanted to be part of Rome, you accepted Christianity, and all Germanic tribes wanted to do that. And so there was this kind of, it was just going to happen one way or the other, because Christianity was part and parcel of Rome. Right.
This is such an important point. Let me just pause and compliment you on starting the presentation that way, because it's great, right? I mean, like we so often, I think people present Christianity and Christianization as kind of more in a vacuum, where it's almost more of an ideological decision, but it really mostly isn't. Mm-hmm. This is really part of we are aspiring to a lifestyle. This is part of that lifestyle. This is part of the social signals that get us into the good life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of your audience may be familiar with the very famous clip from Monty Python's Life of Brian. What have the Romans ever done for us? You know that, right? Where you can think of that here in a certain sense. The Romans have done a lot, right? And they represent a lot, and most people kind of want a part of that. And the Germanic tribes were no different. Christianity was simply part of that.
Right.
So that would be one point. Now, what wasn't inevitable was that Rome convert to Christianity in the first couple of centuries. I mean, there were many, many other competitors for Christianity. There were mystery religions of various kinds, Mithraism, various very, very charismatic sorts of religions that were floating around that Christianity was in competition with. And I don't think it was inevitable that Christianity gained the status that it did in Rome. Beginning, under Constantine, and then later on under Theodosius II, I believe it was, right? Other choices could have been made. That was not inevitable. There's more contingency there, I think, than in the later decisions of the Germanic barbarians to become Christian. Another contingent factor is Clovis chose Catholicism over Arianism, right? That wasn't necessarily inevitable, right? All the other Germanic tribes at the time, almost all of them, right? The Goths, the Burgundians, the Lombards, they first chose and the Arian form of Christianity, and Clovis, for essentially political reasons, chose Catholicism, but that was not inevitable, right? So those are the two.
Could you take a moment to explain what Arianism was?
Yeah. So basically, it's a very complex theological dispute. The Arian version of Christianity did not consider Jesus Christ and God the Father to have the same status, right? Jesus Christ was not of the same substance as the Father, but of a similar substance. And he also came into being, he was a created being, according to Arius, right? Who was not himself a Germanic theologian. I can't remember exactly where he came from.
Right. Hold on, I'm trying to split these hairs here. But it's amazing. This is something people killed each other over.
They did, yes. It was a very, very brutal conflict. And yes, and then Catholics believe that Jesus Christ was eternal, had always been at the right hand of the Father, and that he was of the same substance as the Father. So there are two Greek words that differ by one vowel, which means similar and same. And so the whole controversy between Arianism and Catholic Christianity depended on this one little theological dispute. But as you pointed out, it was a huge thing, and led to some very brutal conflicts. And so that would be, that's that. Now, yeah, all the other Germanic tribes, because most of them had been converted under Arian theologians and under Arian Roman emperors, I think, in the East. That would be the case with the Goths, and they just retained that, right? So, but Clovis chose Catholicism, right? So let's see. One other very important point is that many people in the modern world tend to look back on the destruction of paganism or the conversion from paganism to Christianity, and they see a lot more violence in this period than there actually was. What happens there is that people think of the high medieval church, right, that persecuted heretics, that started burning people at the stake, that sent crusaders into the Holy Land. They tend to project the persecuting church of the high Middle Ages back onto the early Middle Ages and see it also in the early Christian mission. And that's simply not the case. The vast majority of conversions that took place up until Charlemagne, I would say, were mostly voluntary and mostly peaceful. Now, there was violence. We're going to look at a couple of violent episodes, but it was more violence against things than against people. Okay, it was a violence against pagan shrines and trees and idols and things like that. But there was not a great deal of violence against persons. Now, Charlemagne does represent an example. We talked about that last time, right? If you look at the first Saxon capitulary, which comes from the early 770s, just when the war began, it says things like, well, if someone's caught practicing pagan rites, death, right? The penalty for everything, even minor breaking the fast, death, right? Now, we don't know. What we do not know is whether those those very draconian statutes in the first Saxon capitulary were ever implemented. We don't know whether people were actually killed for those sorts of infractions, right? And relatively soon, within a decade, I believe, that was all revised. And the second capitulary for Saxonia was much more mild, and all those death penalties, most of them were removed. So it didn't work in practice. But again, so the early medieval mission, the conversion of the Germanic tribes, was mostly a peaceful affair, mostly a voluntary affair. Now, that does not mean that the people in the countryside had a choice, right? That's simply because, Germanic societies were top down, and whatever decision the ruler made, that's what happened. Now, he didn't do it by fiat, right? Clovis did not say, I'm going to become a Catholic, and then everybody else has to. He consulted his elite. He consulted his nobles. He wanted to make the right decision for the social elite in Francia. And then, of course, the people converted, or, actually, Clovis didn't really pay attention to what was going on in the countryside too much. He wasn't all that concerned. But to the extent that people became Christian, it was not a situation where the missionaries were coming in there and using violence against persons to convert them by force. It was mostly a peaceful, voluntary affair on the part of the social elites in these Germanic tribes. So I guess the only other thing I would say before we get into the sources is that not only are the sources all from a Christian perspective, most of them are later, written considerably later than the events they purport to talk about. And so there's always the question of, well, what were the sources of, say, Gregory of Tours and talking about Clovis? He's writing 70 years after Clovis's conversion. What are the sources of Bede's a discussion of the early mission in Britannia? He's writing a century and 120 years after the events that he talks about. So that's another thing to keep in mind. We'll talk about a couple episodes from Bede where he's putting words in the mouth of pagans. And is that fiction? Is that what are his sources? We don't know. So that's just a thing there. So I think I've gotten through all of the introductory things. Yeah.
Great intro. I mean, I really appreciate you connecting the context of Christianization to the context of Romanization, because I do think that is extremely often forgotten in contextualizing this history.
Oh, yeah. In Rocky Mountain 2 Historic Wildlife Mentions, by the way, it's spelled Aryanism. We're not Aryan, Aryanism, right? That's a just important thing to keep in mind. I imagine most of the people in this group would know that, but it's just
worth pointing out. Yeah.
It's always important to point that out. So Clovis. Yeah. So Clovis was a Frank living in northern Francia, France, Belgium, that area, and he converted to Catholic Christianity sometime right around 500, maybe give or take a few years. And it was an enormously influential and important moment that kind of set the stage for a lot of what happened in Western Europe after that. It was, as I mentioned before, all of his Germanic fellow kings were Aryans. And so they were trying to make alliances with him at the time. And in converting to Christianity and not Aryanism, he said, nope, I'm doing my own thing, right? I'm not really interested in what you're doing. And it was a declaration of independence within the Germanic world. That was one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is Clovis, one thing that becomes very important in later Frankish history is this working together between the Frankish kings and the bishops of Rome, the Pope, right? And that becomes like the main axis of early medieval power politics, right? Mm. And so Clovis was interested in Rome and the Bishop of Rome and the Pope as a possible ally in what he was doing. The other main reason is that this is probably perhaps the most important reason is that Clovis's subject population, the Gallo-Roman population living in Gaul, they were Catholics. Hmm.
Mhm.
And he was interested in, this is part of the Romanization thing, right? He was interested in really governing them and in availing themselves of what they had to offer and being well integrated with them and establishing a real kingdom and not simply a group of warrior elites lording it over a subject population. That's what the other Germanic tribes are doing at this time in Iberia, the Goths in the Iberian Peninsula, and to a certain extent in Italy as well. The Ostrogoths or the Burgundians, they were an elite, very much above the subject population, not really interacting with them much, not really intermarrying with them much. But Clovis was more interested in really kind of governing his Gallo-Roman population, and one way to do that was adopt their religion. Right, Remigius, the bishop that baptized him, was a Gallo-Roman bishop, and that was his main interlocutor in this enterprise. So
that makes sense, and an excellent anthropological point too. I mean, I think sometimes this is another thing that gets misrepresented, is that there's just this wave of Germanic speakers who overlay this population, and somehow that population like disappears for a while, but they're obviously still there in huge numbers, and it's their language that will prevail.
Right. Yeah, the fact that their language prevails, I think, is an indication that going way back, the Franks were not really interested in maintaining a separate identity, or they couldn't do their involvement with the Gallo-Roman subject population became so intense that the Romanic language prevailed in that situation. So now there's one account of Clovis's conversion, and that is provided by Gregory of Tours, the Bishop of Tours, in the later 6th century. He's writing in the 570s, something like that. So he's writing, as I mentioned, 70 years or so after the conversion. And he gives us a lot of detail about the conversion. And I can just describe a little bit of that. They're wonderful stories to read, by the way. I've given you links there for them. The 3 main episodes in the conversion. And the first episode is Clovis's wife, Clotilda. I don't have some more to say about her in a bit, because one of your commenters one of you sent a question about Clotilda, and she's a very interesting person. Anyway, Clovis's wife Clotilda is a Christian, and she's trying to convert him. And there's wonderful dialogues in Gregory the Great where she's dissing his Germanic gods, saying they're just made out of stone or wood or some metal. They can't really do anything, these gods, whereas I worship the God who created the worlds. And why would you not want to worship a god like that rather than some, useless object, right? And she also criticizes him for worshiping gods that are perverts, right? She ascribes to Clovis, to her husband, the worship of Saturn. Now, I'll come back to that point in a bit, but Saturn and Jupiter and Mercury. And she says about Jupiter that he's a pervert. And she quotes a line from the Aeneid, talking about Jupiter's his incestuous marriage with his sister Hera, right? And what this probably is, this dialogue probably didn't happen the way that Gregory describes, because what it seems to indicate is that Gregory of Tours did not actually know anything about Germanic religion. It's certainly the case that the Germanic pagans were worshiping gods that the Romans talked about under their Roman names. And this goes all the way back to Tacitus. So, and we'll see with the Geismar oak, right? That was called the oak of Jupiter, right? But what Gregory seems to think is that Clovis actually did worship Saturn, or the Greco-Roman Jupiter, because Clotilda is quoting from the Aeneid, right? And so I think that means that Gregory the Great, he's so far past this history that he simply doesn't know anything anymore about the Germanic religion that Clovis did have. And so he fills in bits from his educated Roman imagination, right? Yeah. But anyway, Clotilda, she's persuading him, and Gregory's like, no, I'm not interested in that. And by the way, one of the children that we had together has died, and how could a all-powerful God let a child die? So how powerful is your God actually? And but anyway, Clovis is not actually preventing Clotilda from baptizing their children into Catholicism. He's accepting that. Okay, that would be episode 1, the interview, the conversations between Clotilda and Clovis. Episode 2 puts us on the battlefield near the town of modern German town of Zülpich, Tolbiacum back then, in war with the Alamans. And he's losing. Clovis is in the process of losing this battle against the Alemanni. And then suddenly he realizes, wait a minute, Clotilda said her God was powerful. So I'm going to call on the Christian God at this moment of desperation and see whether he can do anything for me. And so he calls out to the Christian God, and lo and behold, the Alemanni turn in flight, and Clovis is like, wow, I guess this Christian God can do something, right? Now, there's also a source for that, and that would be the story of Constantine and his conversion to Christianity in, what was it, 313 or something like that, in the battle against one of his competitors on the Milvian Bridge, where Constantine achieved victory in the sign of Christ, and he had a dream and things like that. So this episode is very much influenced by that particular source. Now, it doesn't mean that nothing like that could have happened. I mean, it's certainly possible that that's based on an actual episode. We don't know. We only have Gregory's account. But I think that maybe the literary stylization of that was owed more to that episode in the life of Constantine. Mm-hmm. So that would be the second thing. And then the third episode was Clovis's baptism by Bishop Remigius in the city of Reims, sometime thereafter. We don't know exactly when that happened. The chronology here is a little bit uncertain, but it was a baptism, hugely festive occasion. All the Frankish nobility were there. Some 3,000 nobles converted or baptized at the same time that Clovis was baptized. And Remigius says to him at the moment where he steps into the baptismal font, he says something like, now worship what you have persecuted and persecute what you have worshipped. Right. So it's a nice little Latin phrase there. But yeah, so that the bishop is actually calling upon Clovis to begin the mission himself. Right. Persecute what you worshipped hitherto. Right. Your Germanic religion. Now, Clovis doesn't actually go about doing any missionary work. We'll talk about that in a second. But anyway, those are the 3 main episodes of Clovis's conversion that are told by Gregory the Great. It's actually the most detail we have about the conversion of any of these Germanic rulers in the early Middle Ages. Although it's to be treated with skepticism, right? Whether it actually happened this way. But of course, ancient history writing is filled with detailed speeches given by people or intimate dialogues that the historian could not possibly have known whether it happened that way. We don't know.
And the tropes, right? I mean, the tropes that just swim around and pop up here and there and yon, because you see some similar tropes in the conversion of Scandinavian rulers, or the accounts of the conversion of Scandinavian rulers, and even in the accounts of the conversion of Scandinavian commoners, like you get in the sagas of Icelanders, like in Njál's saga.
That's right. Yeah.
Even the trope of insulting the gods with some quote. Actually, we see it in Njál's saga. With a quote that does use the proper names of the Norse gods. But of course, it's not surprising that in Latin language sources on the continent that, again, are, generations after these events, that they're not going to say Donar, because it's like, who in the learned world remembers who Donar, Thonar, whatever it is?
Right. Yeah, exactly. The Pikes by, I believe is it Adrian? I believe it's Adrian.
Yeah.
He writes, don't forget all the children, baptized children die. Yeah. That's actually not true. The first one does. The second one comes close to death, but then he comes back and he doesn't actually die. And so that is perhaps I think Clotilda says something like, "Look, he didn't die. God saved him." But the first one does die, I believe, maybe more than one, but at least one of them does survive in that account by Gregory of Tours. Now, yeah, so that would be Clovis's baptism. Now, one of the people who sent a question said, how did Clovis's conversion affect his interactions with, I don't remember, he gave some names there, some of his family members.
Are you talking about Gregory's question? How has conversion affected his rule, specifically with regard to Hararik, Cloderic, and Rothar? Is that right?
Yeah. I didn't have time to actually look up who these people were or find to read the relevant passages in Gregory the Great. But to answer this question, you don't really need to, because you can pretty much safely say that Clovis's conversion did not affect him in the slightest when it came to what he did politically. And Gregory himself, there's a very famous anecdote, I'm sure some of your hearers may know it. Right at the end of, after he reports on Clovis's death, he said, right at the end of his life, Clovis was lamenting the fact that there were no more relatives around, that he was very, very sad. And Gregory says, well, you might think that he was truly sad, but of course he wasn't. All that he was trying to do was to see whether there were any surviving relatives that he could kill, right? To make sure that his power remained uncontested. So, I mean, Clovis was an incredibly brutal person. We have no evidence that Christianity affected him inwardly in the slightest, right? To the extent that he was a Christian, it was simply that the Christian God helped him in battle that one time, if that's true, which is possibly true, and that working as a Christian allowed him to achieve politically what he wanted in terms of this rapprochement with the Gallo-Roman population, to consolidate his rule much more in the interior of his land. It was a purely practical decision on his part. Now, I don't think he was really much different than any other Germanic king in that regard. I mean, there was this practical aspect to becoming a Christian. It was all about becoming a Roman, becoming involved with in the Roman world in a way like that. And by the way, Clovis also took on a Roman title. He was given the title of consul and patrician, Roman patrician. All these Germanic kings thought of themselves as becoming Roman. And that goes all the way through to Charlemagne. The idea that the Roman Empire came to an end really is a late medieval idea. It really gets started in the 10th and 11th centuries. All these Germanic kings, and this includes Charlemagne, are thinking that what they're doing is they're renovating the Roman. They're making Rome great again, right? To put it in modern terms. But they're not really, nobody at this time is thinking, well, the Roman Empire is over.
Yeah.
I'm going to found my Germanic kingdom that will one day turn into France or Germany or whatever. They're not thinking in those terms. They're thinking, I'm becoming Roman. I am now a Roman myself. And
I think that's a really incisive point to make here too, that to a large degree, the Catholic Church is a continuation of the ecclesiastical power of the Roman Empire. The secular power, there's sort of a vacuum, but they consider themselves to be filling that exact vacuum.
Yeah.
Like that is the polity that they're thinking of. They're not thinking of, I don't know, like in Norse terms, Frakland, right? Francia or whatever. That's not their polity that they think of. Like right. The polity is the Roman Empire. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Now, Clovis also, he was not concerned about the Christianization of his Germanic Franks in the countryside. As I mentioned, there were a large number of Frankish nobles that converted with him. And for essentially for a couple of centuries, it pretty much stays that way. There's no big missionary impulse that goes out from the Merovingian court, right? That only happens under the Frankish kings, and we'll get to that. But we have this long period, really between 500 and the mid 8th century, where the Frankish or the Merovingian kingdom is essentially Christian. People are nominally Christian, but large swaths of the countryside are, we don't really know what's happening there. And a lot of interesting stuff is happening there. And I would just make a couple of generalizations about this. The Merovingians are primarily interested in the church here as a system of royal patronage, right? And so the church that develops under the Merovingians, a German word is often used to describe it. It's the Adelskirche, the church of the nobility. That means the bishop positions are being staffed by members of the Merovingian family and their retainers, because it's a cushy job being a bishop in a nice city, in a nice Roman city. And so you have the leadership positions in the Frankish Church are taken over by Frankish nobles, and they're essentially sinecures. And the bishops themselves do not seem to be, on the whole, they do not seem to be very interested in bringing the mission into the countryside. They are very worldly fellows, right? Many of them don't even give up their warrior lifestyle. And so the idea of the mace swinging bishop who rides to battle with his Merovingian sovereign, this comes from this period. I mean, many bishops are fighting battles also as well. So they're not really, taking on board the spirit of the gospel, for example, that will become much more important later on, as we talked about in the Helions, right? So the Frankish Church is not really, it's not really inwardly lit with the spirit of Christianity yet, right? Now missionary activities start to happen right around this time. There's a first wave of missionaries that come from actually Ireland, beginning in the 500s and early 600s. Okay, and these Irish monks start to come onto the continent. They leave Ireland, they come onto the continent, they start to found monasteries. But these monks too, they're not really interested in bringing Christianity to the people. The Irish, and this has to do with a peculiar thing about Irish Christianity. Irish Christianity is very, very inward looking, right? These Irish monks are fired by the spirit of making what they call a peregrinatio, a pilgrimage, right? And that's because they want to purify themselves from their inward sins. And the way to do that is to tear yourself away from your people, to go to a distant place and to found a monastery and to lead a life of contemplation. So this Hiberno-Scottish mission is very inward looking. A lot of monasteries are founded, but these Hiberno-Scottish monks are not really going into the countryside and converting the pagan population or the semi-Christian population. They're not really concerned about that. That's not really what they're doing. It's kind of an inward-looking thing. Now these Irish Scottish monks do found monasteries, and they start to accumulate books and start to accumulate wealth, which becomes important for the later wave of the mission, right? But on a large scale, on a systematic scale, they're not really conducting the mission themselves, these first Irish monks, this mission. That only happens with the so-called Anglo-Saxon mission, which gets started in the 600s and early 700s. And this is where this culminates in Germania anyway, with Saint Boniface, who is an Anglo-Saxon who comes to the continent in the early 700s and makes an alliance with a new bunch of Frankish rulers, the Carolingians, who supplant the Merovingians in the mid 700s, early and mid 700s, and so that's how the real missionary activity in the Frankish countryside, that's how it really gets started in a systematic way in the mid 8th century. So we can turn to that in a second now, but I can keep going, or if you want to make any comments, or should I just keep going?
Yeah, I would say keep going. There's some discussion in the commentary, but I don't think there's anything to stop you from keeping going with this. I'm enjoying the account. I mean, you have thought about this a lot to be able to organize this kind of.
I've actually taught this a good bit in a certain course. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a bit, but
okay.
This is one of my favorite periods because there's just so much going on, and
in spite of the reputation of the quote unquote dark ages, I mean, there is information. It's just that the information is kind of at secondhand, and it's in obscure sources, and sometimes it's sort of difficult to read.
Adrian also mentions an episode from Fredegar, which I can perhaps talk about. Not this particular anecdote, but Fredegar under another aspect later. But he mentions there's a nice anecdote in Fredegar about Clovis at his baptism. When he heard about the Passion of Christ, he supposedly proved his true Christianity by saying, "Had I been there with my Franks, I would have avenged Jesus." That sounds like Clovis. That sounds like Clovis to me. Yeah, there's another anecdote from Gregory of Tours where, after a battle, the Franks are dividing their spoils, and one of his Frankish warriors takes this vessel that once belonged in a church that was looted from some church. And I think it's a bishop, maybe it's even Remigius, I don't quite remember, doesn't want this vessel to be given over as spoils. He would like to put it back in the church, but this disaffected Frankish aristocrat breaks it in pieces and takes his bit of it, and then Clovis kills him, and for having the audacity to take an artifact from the church. And he had some pithy comment that he gave, but I can't remember what it is now. But yeah, so Clovis saw a violent solution to pretty much everything, including church, including his even Christianity. Right.
And does that also speak to what it means when these people convert? That it's not this ideological conversion the way that we typically think. If someone tells you in 2024, I've converted to this religion, you expect there's some kind of ideological persuasion that's gone on there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is actually not a great example, but the way people talk about it, quote unquote, road to Damascus moment. This is much more about like, what are we considering sacred? What's off limits? What names are we invoking? And it's like, oh yeah, the Gospels, like I've heard of those. Probably, It's like this guy's probably never heard them read to him. He certainly hasn't read them.
That's a very good question. We don't know anything about what languages Clovis spoke, whether he had rudimentary Latin. I mean, Charlemagne had some Latin, but this is long before any of these texts are available in any kind of vernacular language. None of the Frankish elite can understand Latin on any sophisticated level at all. So simply how it would have been that what Christianity actually meant was communicated to the Frankish nobility. It's a very, at least in the early generation, right? It's a puzzle. We have no information on that. Right? We have no information on what Clovis would have known about Christianity and what it, what was expected of him. But nobody was in a position to really hold him to account. I mean, he was too powerful, and the bishops, the Gallo-Roman bishops, could just be glad that they had him on their side now, right? They weren't going to read him the riot act if he misbehaved, and at that point,
right? He's moved from one, well, to put it in a churchy way, one communion to another communion.
Yeah.
Without becoming a different person, or probably without really considering, again, like ideological implications of that. Yeah.
So we have this long period of 2 centuries where before the mission really ramps up. And so what's happening in Francia during those 2 centuries? Well, it's not nothing is happening. I think the way to think about it is the following. Even though the Frankish elite, and that includes the bishops, were not really pushing the mission, I think, Christianity being what it is, I think there were always a significant number of people at the lower levels who were animated by this true spirit of Christianity and wanted to bring the message to the people, right? I think that's a very powerful impulse within Christianity to inspire people to go out and bring the good news to those who have not yet heard it. And I think that happened quite a bit in Francia in the 500s, in the 600s, and in the 700s. But it happened on a low level for which there is very little record, right? And the way we know that is there's all kinds of evidence that Christianity is out there in the countryside. There's evidence that there's interesting mixes between Christianity and paganism. And there's quite a bit of evidence for that. It's just not being centrally directed and pushed from the top. It kind of percolates out there. It's very unsystematic. In many cases, it leads to some very unorthodox things, and there's quite a bit of evidence for interesting bits of syncretism that happen, I think, out in the countryside. Now, I've given a list of various things that we can look at here. So for example, I think this happened. Just a few more general comments here. This is how it was for a long period of time. Now, I'm thinking ahead to things that you probably know a good bit about, like, for example, this very famous character in the Landnama book, Helgi the Lean, I believe his name is. Mm-hmm. I think you've talked about this before. He says, he worships Christ, but when he's at sea and in a storm, right, he worships Thor. Do I have that correct?
I think that's right. It's like, but Thor is better at sea. It may be the reverse of that, but I think that's right. Yeah.
So there's a character who, the Christian God is very much on his radar, and he has his uses, and he might even be calling himself Christian. But, in certain cases, well, Thor is responsible for,
you got to be practical.
Something. Yeah. Right. So there's a mix there. And it's always mentioned in this context, these molds where you can produce from one side of the mold a Christian cross and the other side of a mold the Thor's hammer, right? These things are much later, of course. That's around 1,000 or 900 or something like that. Well, there's quite a bit of evidence for similar mixings going on in Francia in the 600s and in the 700s. So your readers can, the listeners can look at things like the Niederdollendorf stone from the 700s and the Greisen stone from the 700s. These show warrior figures that seem to be, are they Christ? Are they Odin? Are they some mix, right? Are they some militant interpretation of the Christ figure? Yeah, there we go. Now, I'm not an archaeologist, and all that I have done is read rather superficially on these. But these seem to be figures that seem to. My reading on these are Christ figures cast in a warrior mode that would be in an iconic language intelligible to a Germanic warrior, representing how powerful of a warrior Christ is. And this would be something that Clovis would have fought on the battlefield of Tolbiacum in 498 or whenever it was, when he thought that the Christian God intervened in this battle against the Alemanni, right? This might be how he envisioned a figure like Christ is helping him in battle. There's a nice German word for this, and a god as a Sieghelfer, right? A victory helper. Mm-hmm. And that's the Niederdollendorf stone, and the Greisen stone is somewhat similar. The Greisen stone shows a similar figure with a rather large penis. Click on the next one. This is simply the next.
Wait, the next. Image, I see.
Yeah, I couldn't find the image in the Wikipedia page, but if you zoom in that figure, a mixture of pagan iconography and Christian iconographical motifs. There's a large penis there, so that indicates that it's probably not a pure Christ figure, but also is brought into association with various potent conceptions of the divine that derive more from Germanic religion. I think in the temple at Uppsala, much later, recorded by Adam of Bremen, I think there's a rather large phallus associated with Frey in that temple. So something like that.
Yeah. There's also depictions of Frey from Viking Age Scandinavia that are ithiphallic.
Yeah. So those would be a couple of archaeological artifacts. A couple in the written sources. There's a letter. One of the letters of letter to Boniface from I think a pope, talking about two chieftains practicing somewhere in Francia, ruling over a small polity somewhere in Francia. And it is mentioned how they are, quote, practicing the sacrilegious worship of idols under the cloak of Christianity, right? So there's textual evidence for some sort of mixture there. One of the letters the Pope sends to Boniface he talks about a Christian priest. What is it now? A Christian priest who sacrifices to Jupiter and partakes of pagan sacrificial offerings here. So this is a member of the Frankish clergy who is continuing to send to make sacrifices to Jupiter in this case. So there's a little anecdote from much further east and south along the Danube somewhere where I've given you I couldn't find an English language source, so I just noted the page in Latin here. A local bishop runs into a woman who is a pagan sorceress bringing animals to church to offer as sacrifices for the efficacy of her incantations. So there's all kinds of ways in which the Christianity is percolating into the countryside, and it's not really, it's kind of undergoing strange admixtures with local folk religions, and so just interesting sorts of mixes are happening there. And this goes on for a couple of centuries, and between 500 and the early 700s, we don't have accounts of missionaries going out there and trying to set people straight with regard to their orthodoxy, right? It's just kind of happening, right? Stuff like that. This is also going on in England. The Sutton Hoo burial is mixed Christian pagan. The person who is thought to be buried there, a certain Redwald, there is, he's very interesting. There's an account of him in Bede, if that's indeed whose grave it is, account of him in Bede. And he's married to a pagan woman who insists that he not convert, right? She wants to maintain her religion. And so he sets up two altars, a Christian altar and a pagan altar. And, he covers both bases there. So that went on quite a bit, I think, in this time. And we have very little evidence of it, but there are indications that it's there. And it's probably how people lived in Francia for many, many decades.
Yeah, and I guess there's something there also that's a reminder that, as you said, we're not talking about the Church of the Inquisition. The Church at this time doesn't have the resources in these areas to actually run like an Inquisition. So they're probably kind of taking what they can get as far as nobles converting.
Right. As I mentioned, maybe we should talk a little bit about the Merseburg charms here. Now, that is, I mentioned this, the only surviving purely pagan textual source that we have from this area, from this time, and from this place. There are two, just I can really only get into just a little bit of what these texts are. There are two little charms in Old High German, some Frankish dialect of Old High German, and one charm is a charm for the release of prisoners. And it is women, female figures, who preside over the release of these characters here. So on that first line in poetry, the third word, idisi, right? Disir. This is a word that indicates a woman of some. Is this a goddess? Is this a noble? Noble women are called disir at this time, idisi. This is a word given to women of higher social status, possibly goddesses also in this poem. These may be possibly Valkyrie-like figures who come down and release captive warriors from their bonds, things like that. There's a lot of talk about, a lot of speculation as to who these women are. Anyway, this is a little charm for the release of prisoners, and female deities are being invoked to do that. The second one is a charm. Second Merseburg charm there, if you can scroll down, is a charm to heal a horse with an injured leg. And both of these charms have two parts, right? There's a little mythological narrative and then the actual language of the charm, which is very invocative and exhortatory, asking the magic to actually come into effect. And this little the first bit of the second Merseburg charm is interesting because it mentions Germanic gods. Right now, we're familiar with Wodan, and we're familiar with Balder. But everyone, and Freya also, that would be Odin's wife. All the other god names, we don't quite know who exactly they are, right? Fol there, Phol.
Well, but Fola would be Frigg's servant in the Eddas. So there is a parallel for her. Fola, but not Fol.
Is it spelled the same?
No, it's Fulla in Old Icelandic.
Oh, okay. Well, I had forgotten that, or I didn't know that. Phol, who is that? We don't quite know. Sintgund and Sunna, who are these characters? So,
I guess Sunna could be the sun, right?
Could be, yes. And Sintgund, that actually is a word that, I mean, if you look at what the words mean, Sint is something like path, and Gunt means something like battle, right? So that's a name that indicates perhaps a martial quality, something like that. So, but these are, this is a pure bit of pagan poetry surviving, probably written down sometime in the 700s, recorded a few decades later in a monastery in Fulda, made its way to Merseburg much later. The manuscript was put together in Fulda, apparently. So this is the one bit of pure paganism surviving in a text from this time. Very precious and very interesting. One of your one of the audience sent in a question about the parallels in other languages and in other cultures. And if you look further down on this webpage, I really don't know much more than what this Wikipedia site indicates. All kinds of parallels. The most striking one is the one all the way at the bottom, which points to an old Indian parallel. There you go, ancient India. Very strikingly similar language, bone to blood, bone to bone, that kind of language in the second part of the charm. Now, the scholarship on this is there are those people who say, yes, this attests to an ancient tradition that goes all the way back to the Indo-Europeans for such magic. And there's a direct line of transmission from the ancient Indo-European predecessors to all the way through to the second Merseburg charms. That's certainly possible. I mean, the language of, the language is, this kind of language is incredibly conservative. And it's very possible that these sorts of incantations did survive all the way up until through Christianization. It's also possible that, the language in these, it's kind of formulaic and when you actually have to work magic and you want to put two pieces of a body that have been cut apart together, there's probably not a whole lot of different ways to say, well, bone join up with other piece of bone, right? Bone to bone, something like that. It's a kind of maybe there's a kind of a way in which that language automatically suggests itself in that particular context, right? If you are trying to summon the magical powers in creation and bring them to bear on the situation here and exhort them to happen, that formula might originate independently in different languages, in different contexts, without there being this direct line of transmission from healer to healer over the centuries. I don't quite know there. I am agnostic on that particular thing, but it is very interesting that there's many, many parallels. There's whole dissertations and whole books written on these charms and the ways in which they are subtly pagan in their, their Christianizations of pagan magical formulae, all kinds of stuff on that. I don't know a whole lot about that, but you can do a very deep dive on those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I suspect that outside the Indo-European tradition, you'd probably find a lot of similar wording and charms. There were a couple questions in the comments about this word and whether this is related to Old Norse "dis," which I'm going to spell in the worst way in my spelling. This is actually something I'm agnostic about. It's, I think, a little unclear that these are etymologically the same word. Edis could go back to a root that's actually the "ed" itself could be part of a root, or the E
Okay.
arguably be a prefix. Old Norse does drop prefixes. I don't know what that prefix E is, if it's a prefix. But I'm kind of agnostic about it. You don't see dies used for like lady or noblewoman in Old Norse the way that you do in Continental Germanic. It's really restricted to a mythological context. So
Ah.
it could be the same word. It could not be. I'm a little agnostic about it. I don't know.
Hmm. I believe we mentioned in the last time the Eve figure in the Genesis fragments of the Old Saxon Genesis. The Paradise fragment, and I believe Eve is called a Disir or something. I think that word is used there for her. I'd have to go back and check that, but yeah.
Hey, could I suggest, since I think we still have some material to cover here, could I suggest we take an intermission here to let people?
Yeah, certainly. Sure. Before we get on to the Geismar Oak, and I want to turn to that next, so something more about women. And this goes to the question that I was sent about Clotilda. Now, Clotilda obviously played a huge role in Clovis's conversion, regardless of whether we think that those interviews or those conversations were fictionalized by Gregory. I mean, it's certainly the case that she would have played an enormous role. But she's only one of several women who are Christian and who are married to pagan Germanic men. I've given you a list of them on that page there. There's half a dozen of them. And so this seems to be kind of a particular kind of typical situation that you have in the Germanic world at this time, is that women are becoming Christian more sooner than their menfolk, and then they're exerting an influence there. And I think this kind of brings up a couple of questions. First of all, did Christianity appeal to women more than to men? Now, we know from early Christianity, St. Jerome's interactions with women, for example, that Christianity was a very woman-friendly religion, much more so than many others. And there were many very powerful women who got involved in early Christianity. I think, there was definitely an appeal to women of Christianity, and perhaps more appealing than the versions of the Germanic pagan religions that were being practiced at the time. Now, that's interesting because if you read Tacitus, Tacitus says, well, the Germanic peoples honored their women because they considered women to have this gift of prophecy and this kind of holiness within themselves, right? And in the first century AD, we learn of powerful seeress type figures. Like in the 60s and 70s AD, Tacitus describes the revolt of the Batavian tribe in the Netherlands today, a Germanic confederation that was working for the Romans, but decided to break off on their own. And that's the Batavian revolt. And they had a very powerful priestess figure there named Veleda. We also hear a couple of other names by Tacitus. It seems to be possible that women played a much more central role to Germanic paganism in the ancient world, and that in the course of the folk migration, the migration era, Germanic pagan religions became much more masculinized and women became marginalized more. And so perhaps there's a sense in which women kind of saw Christianity as a pathway towards regaining kind of a status within the world of religion that they knew that they had in previous versions of Germanic paganism, that they had lost in the first few centuries AD as religion became much more warrior-like, as Odin took over from. This is a kind of a very speculative thing on my part, but I don't know. It seems to me that it's possible that that part of Christianity's appeal to women had something to do with the loss of status of noble women in Germanic societies. You would perhaps know more about that than me, but anyway, that's one idea.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting speculation. I would probably just add to the speculation that I wonder if it doesn't even require this awareness of a loss of status if that happened, but rather just the fact that the church, as far as the church is concerned, a soul is a soul. And So, a noble woman's soul is as good as a noble man's. If and so, women might be sort of, um, I mean, to use very 21st century terminology about it, marketed to,
Yeah.
in a way that would emphasize that, like, and I wonder if that helped bring more women in, just because the sense that, like, oh well, this is actually a place where I have a little bit more value than I have in
Yeah.
this sort of native structure.
And probably also canny churchmen saw women folk as a way of making inroads into uh, uh, um, these pagan societies, right? I think that's a possibility as well. Um,
Yeah, and men's status being so tied up with their martial
yeah,
valor, I could see that, there might be a sense in which, to some extent, again, speculatively, there might be couples where both want to approach that higher cosmopolitan status of being Christian, but it's really more socially acceptable for the woman to kind of dip her toe in first.
or socially acceptable, or simply, the women are just less involved in public life, right? All
Yeah.
religions have a public and a private dimension, and since women, there's not a lot of public pressure on them in the same way that there are with men. They're more free to make a kind of a more private choice in terms of their religion.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
They
Yeah.
don't have to represent the religion as much cultically, I think, as the men do at this point, where every action that the man does, right, they need to and they're under less pressure from their from other elites, right, from their retainers, right, to keep the old time religion, because that's what's going to help us going into battle, right? Is if we have a good relationship with the tutelary god, that kind of thing. Women are, they don't have that kind of pressure on them, and so they're free to make a private choice, perhaps, at this point.
And by contrast, in a society like that, the women might start to put some pressure on each other, right? That there may be some social pressure toward, like, hey, we're all doing this, right?
Yeah,
Because the nobility always have their fashions. I mean, it could almost
right.
become like a fashion among
Yeah,
some groups. Yeah.
that's a good point. Yeah, that's a definitely a good point. All right, so let's talk about the Geismar Oak. This is really the one account, a detailed account of a pagan shrine that we have from Francia. There's a few in Bede. This is the only one in Francia that has any detail, and it's really just a couple paragraphs in the life of Saint Boniface, written sometime in the later 8th century, and the events themselves happened in 723, 724, right? Somewhere in Hesse, there's a place called Geismar, and there was apparently a big oak there, which is called a robor Jobis, right? The oak of Jove or Jupiter, who, according to the usual equivalent between Germanic and Roman mythologies, represents Donar or Thor. And it's described how Boniface comes in and, against resistance from the locals, destroys the tree. What happens there is that he begins to cut it down and gets just a little cut in there, and then the divine power comes and tears the whole thing down. And the pagans who were gnashing their teeth as Boniface was setting axe to trunk, blown away by the power of the divine power that brought their shrine down, convert then to Christianity, and it's a wonder, right? It's a miracle. And then out of the stem, out of the trunk of the tree, Boniface fashions a shrine to Saint Peter. So it's a very interesting account. First of all, the population that is briefly described in this little town, it's exactly this kind of mixed population. There are people who are Christians there. There are people who were Christians but have returned to the pagan rites. There are people who are Christians that are practicing pagan rites in secret, right? The shrine itself, or the oak itself, is described as a pagan idol. So this seems to be a border zone of some kind, right? It seems to be the very edge of the Frankish Christian world, where you have in the immediate vicinity all kinds of things going on, right? From Christianity to paganism and everything in between, right? Now, this account also, even though it's written temporally quite close to the events and perhaps by people who knew Boniface and I don't know, were there at the time, that's not impossible here. We have to treat this account a little bit skeptically. It does have a textual predecessor, which is very important, and that would be the life of Saint Martin of Tours, who in the mid-4th century came into Tours and started cutting down trees and breaking up pagan shrines against the resistance of the population. And some of the formulations that are used in the life of Saint Boniface are quite similar to those that are used in the life of Saint Martin of Tours. And this author probably knew that life and wanted to tell a similar story, right? How initially resistant population, the saint destroys a pagan shrine, and then the people are overwhelmed at the power of the god and decide to go over en masse to the new religion. Okay. Now, we have to be very careful with the Frankish story because even though nothing is said about the presence of soldiers or the armed might of the Frankish king, we can be absolutely certain that that Boniface had the military support of the Franks in doing this, and that was probably what kept the population at bay from attacking Boniface or killing him as he destroyed their pagan shrine. Now, we know that because there are letters, and I've given you some of these letters in the links there. There are letters from Charles Martel saying, yes, Boniface enjoys our protection, right? There's a late letter by Boniface from about the 740s where he goes back and he's telling the person he's writing to, he's saying, yeah, I could not have done what I did. I could not have conducted my mission without the protection of the Frankish king. I would have failed, right? So this destruction of this pagan shrine probably had military power backing it. That is not represented in the narrative, of course, because it was not in the interest of the narrator to say, yeah, the pagans only let their shrine be cut down because, right, they had no choice, right? It's a very tendentious account. And so that would be one aspect in which we have to treat the source with kid gloves there. Now, the notion of taking the material of the pagan shrine and making a new Christian shrine out of it, that actually corresponds to church practice at the time. There's a letter that Gregory the Great sent to the Anglo-Saxon mission in England in the early 600s, where he says, yeah, when you destroy shrines, destroy the idols that are in pagan temples and pagan shrines, but leave the structures intact. And whatever feasts that were going around, whatever tents that were set up around the pagan shrine, simply use these things and fill them with new Christian meaning, right? Take the structure and make it a structure of Christ and have a feast day for a saint, things like that. He's talking about repurposing pagan material for the purpose of Christianity. And I think we see that with this, with what happened to the wood of the Jupiter oak, right? It's made into a little Christian shrine. And those sorts of strategies may have helped ease a recalcitrant population, ease them into the new religion, those sorts of things. It's a possibility. So yeah, this is the Jupiter oak. I've given also a couple of links to modern day activities that are happening around this Jupiter oak. So there's a monument set up in the city of Fritzlar, which is nearby in Hesse. And beginning in the early 2010s, neo-pagans have started gathering there, and there were a few stories there. This is in the German neo-pagan scene. The destruction of the Jupiter oak and the monument in Fritzlar there. This is this looms large in the German neo-pagan scene. So there's a little film there made by one of the organizers of that protest there, which is very interesting. Gives a lot of interesting information. And
Okay, well, we'd have to go through an ad.
unfortunately, it's only in German, so maybe Adrian and maybe a couple others can understand that. Yeah, so this would be, and I forgot to mention it, but it's obvious. Jupiter oak. What do you think of if you come from a Norse mythology background? Of course, you're thinking of Yggdrasil and the world tree, and this is obviously some local version of that myth that is we see in Norse mythology, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's all instantiations of some common cosmic tree notion, right? I mean,
Yeah.
whether a name like Yggdrasil would be common on the continent, who knows? I think Yggdrasil is probably a fairly late name for that concept anyway.
Yeah.
Given that it's elusive in and of itself. But yeah, I mean, certainly you have to imagine that it would be something somewhat similar.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's associated with, quote unquote, Jupiter. Of course, the art of the Interpretatio Romana is imprecise, but
Right.
that does, make it look like Thor's. And so, well, I mean, there's no real association of Thor with Yggdrasil in Scandinavia. But I guess that's also a reminder that even if this is Thor, Donar, no doubt our Scandinavian sources give us a cousin of the religion that would have been practiced by the Franks, but not the same thing.
Right. Now there's another tree shrine, or it seems to be some sort of tree shrine, a few decades later, and that's the Irminsul. Much less is known about this. There's just one or two lines in a couple of Frankish chronicles about the Irminsul. The Irminsul is in Saxonia proper. And we hear how Charlemagne, in one of his early expeditions at the beginning of the Saxon Wars, goes in there and destroys it and pulls out a lot of treasure and heads back to Franconia. And that's pretty much all we have about what exactly this thing was. The word Irminsul is unlike the Jupiter oak, we only have the Latin name for the Jupiter oak. We don't know what they called it then. In the Germanic language spoken there, but the Irminsul is a Germanic word. Sul would be modern German Säule, which means column. Mm-hmm. So, and
then Jormund in a Norse sense.
Okay, yeah. And Irmin is a word that is. There's been a lot of speculation about what the Irmin means. Probably, I think it is related to you just mentioned what was the word you just mentioned?
So in Old Norse there's Jormund, so like Jormungandr, the serpent that encircles the earth, right. And then the two ravens of Odin circle Jormungandr, the whole earth.
Giant, right? Something giant, right? Would that be?
It may just be big, right?
Yeah. Big column, giant column. It seems to be some sort of tree shrine. I mean, the fact that it's called a sul, which is not a word for tree, maybe it's like the massive trunk of a dead tree, the foliage of which has all fallen off, but the trunk remains, something like that. Nobody quite knows what precisely the Irminsul looked like. Again, we just have the word and a notice of its destruction, and that's it there. But this is another thing that there's a few images from the Irminsul in later iconography. The Irminsul also becomes a very powerful symbol for right-wing Neo-Germanic paganism beginning in the late 19th century. You can find Irminsul and a particular Irminsul image that's associated with those sorts of people. But yeah, so it was destroyed in about 772, in 773. No one knows where it was, where in Saxony it was, but yeah. So those would be two pagan shrines that were, there again, we see what I talked about earlier. We see violence against pagan shrines and pagan things, but not against people, right? Except, of course, Charlemagne. Charlemagne did. There were many deaths associated with his conversion. And I'll just mention it again, right? That was unusual. that was an exception, not the rule. And he got a lot of criticism for that, most notably by Alcuin, who was not on board with his violent methods for converting the Saxons. So generally, the conversion was peaceful in terms of people not coming to violence and being violently compelled to accept Christianity.
It strikes me that in a lot of ways, Charlemagne is an exception to the history that comes from him. Charlemagne makes a lot of decisions that seem peculiarly Charlemagne.
Yeah.
I mean, and that applies to, very minor things like deciding this is how you're going to write letters, to very big things like I'm going to behead these people for not believing in Christ.
Yeah. And we can also observe with him something we talked about in the case of Clovis, is that, to what extent was Charlemagne himself really a Christian? This might sound a little bit heretical, because of course he was, but I mean, Charlemagne, he did not observe the fast. You know this from his life written by Einhard. He did not, he continued to have concubines, right? He did not lead a very Christian life, right? So the things that he was punishing other people for, the things that the early Saxons got the death penalty for, he himself was not observing. So, I mean, for Charlemagne, it's impossible to separate religion from politics. Charlemagne was interested in deeply converting everyone to Christianity because that helped the Frankish kings consolidate a certain sort of power within their society. That's that aspect to it. Now, Charlemagne probably felt he was very pious, and we know that he went to church and sang the hymns and tried to, So I'm not calling into question his own belief that he was a pious Christian, but there's definitely that practical dimension that can't be separated away from him.
Well, it's people in power, no matter what, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think that makes him the exception to the history of people with power.
No.
But yeah, well characterized. This is a great set of links you've put together here. I mean, you spent some time on this, especially in calling attention to like individual letters that are particularly worth looking at here.
Yeah, you can find all that there. Oh, I do need to, under Boniface's mission there, under that heading, I want to refer to this text here called the Index of Pagan Superstitions. Okay. This is, anyone who's medievalist has their list of texts that they know existed once and were destroyed, and you just really are upset about that. I mean, so much has been lost. For any historian of this period who's interested in paganism, there are two lost sources that loom especially large, and one of them is the sources for Tacitus's Germania, which probably go back to a work by Pliny the Elder called the Bella Germaniae, the Germanic Wars, which was apparently a long account of Rome's dealings with the Germanic peoples right around the time of Arminius and the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, which probably has a lot of detail that we have lost, right? That was a long work that Tacitus summarized in his Germania, which is itself a very precious work. And then the other one here, one of the other ones, is the Index of Pagan Superstitions. This is a short text. We only have the chapter titles of this. And this, I imagine this was a treatise of, 20, 30 pages, where it goes into detail about what pagan rites actually looked like at this time, right? These are chapter titles. So we would expect little medieval length chapters under each of these headings, right? That would be a work of some, it could be 20 to 40 pages long. So some monk some group of monks, this is definitely in the train of the Bonifacian mission, compiled a lot of detail about what pagan practices looked like at this time. And this was part of the missionary effort, right? To know what the pagans were doing, and to persuade them to give up these practices and to adopt Christianity. One of the letters to Boniface from a friend of his in England gives him long, detailed instructions about how to talk with pagans, how to convince them that their gods are not real or demons or whatever. And a lot of what he says there reminds us of what Clotilde was telling Clovis, right? Your gods are simply idols made out of stone and metal and wood, and the Christian God is superior because he created the whole universe, right? We have no record that Boniface ever talked to pagan priests or functionaries, or we have no evidence of such conversations. But this document tells us these conversations must have happened in some way. And it's just the rest of the text. We only have the title page, as it were, and all the text is lost. It's a very painful loss.
Yeah.
I would love to know, what these forest shrines looked like, and
I'd like to know what a couple of these words actually are, right? I mean, we've got this Dod Sisas, right? I mean, this looks like he's trying to repeat some kind of vernacular word.
Yes, yes.
There's also the Nimidas.
Yeah, now I looked that one up, and that's apparently a Celtic word.
Oh,
right.
okay.
We have to remember that, we're not only talking about Germanic peoples here. I mean, the further west you go, you're dealing with Celtic peoples as well. So to what extent are there Celtic pagans still hanging around in the countryside there?
Right, sure. I mean, that's
certainly
Germanic.
possible.
This is Germanic. The node fear, the fire, right?
Yes, that's Germanic. Yes. Yep.
Moon damage, which they call Winkeluna, but which looks, I guess it looks romantic, possibly Celtic.
The Luna would be Latin moon. I don't know what Vinca is.
Well, but I was just thinking that a lot of continental Celtic is so much more like Italic. That maybe there's some underlying Celtic word there. Yeah, that's an interesting point.
So this is a source which has been lost, unfortunately.
I think somewhere amid my 1,050 videos back there, I think I might have once made a video highlighting this. I don't remember.
Oh, cool! Wow, you have so many. That's amazing.
I know, it's absurd. They just float out there, and until I just keep trying to recirculate them. Well,
we should talk a little bit about resistance, pagan resistance. Radbod is we cannot not mention him. I
was going to say that's the last thing on your group of links.
Yeah,
that's this.
Yeah, so this is a story from the very late 600s, early 700s. The Frisians were, on the coast there, across from England and a little further up north, Netherlands today. And they resisted Christianization for a few decades longer than the Franks did. Part of that had to do with the fact that they didn't want to kowtow to the Frankish kings. There's a very famous anecdote where the missionary at the time, Willibrord, he's persuaded Radbod to adopt baptism, and this is all mentioned in the Wikipedia article that I linked to there. He's persuaded Radbod to enter the baptismal font, and Radbod steps. He's according to the account, he sets one foot onto the font, and then he turns to Willibrord and he says, "Well, tell me again where my ancestors are. Are they in this this heaven or in this hell that you speak of?" And Willibrord says, "Well, sorry to tell you this, but they're all burning in hell right now. But don't let that deter you." And then Radbod is like, "Well, look, I'm not going to go to a place where I'm hanging out with a bunch of paupers and low-class people. I want to be with my relatives, right? With the noble ancestors of the Frisian kings." And he withdraws his foot from the baptismal font. And so that's a very famous anecdote. What tells you that it probably is based on some truth is that it does not reflect very well on the missionary and his diplomatic skills, right? There's probably ways of handling that situation.
Yeah,
but right. Baptismal font. It's also hard to believe a little bit that Radbod would have been that close to baptism, actually just about to enter the font. I mean, I'm sure that all of these conversations happened beforehand and that the account is stylized a bit for dramatic effect.
Oh yeah, but I mean, it's like you're at the altar, swearing I do, and it's like, wait, who's your dad again? Backing out.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
Anyway, there's a few images and paintings associated with these scenes that come out of the Dutch 19th century. It's kind of a very proud patriotic moment for 19th century Dutch people.
This all looks pretty over the top.
Yeah. So, and I also mentioned that that Redwald, that the Sutton Hoo King, he also, under the aegis of his wife, resisted Christianization longer than many of his compatriots did. So there was resistance, but it could not be maintained, and it eventually they all became Christian.
Yeah, and I think that again, something you've really emphasized from the top here is that this is so much more than the story of religious conversion. This is a whole community switching the community that it's oriented toward, right? And becoming part of something much huge. I mean, it's almost less like resistance today to converting to a religion, which tends to be a more personal thing. And it's more like resistance to accepting Visa and MasterCard, right? It's
Yeah.
like eventually
Right.
everybody is using credit cards. You are going to have to put a credit card reader in your store. And at that point, you're putting the crucifix, which is the Visa and MasterCard sticker on your door. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like
That's good. Yeah.
that's a closer analogy to this.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's a very good analogy. It would have been, it would have, these pagan religions were just so, they did not have the resources, the inner resources to really resist the kind of the juggernaut that Christianity represented. Christianity combined with Roman, the Roman lifestyle, with what it meant to be Roman, these Germanic religions did not have the resources to really fight against that for too long.
Yeah. Yeah. Where are my ancestors who used cash? Well, I'm sorry. They're in cash hell. I don't know. I mean, it's not a perfect analogy, but I'm kind of enjoying it. We've kept you for a long time. I don't know if you want to take any more live questions. I'm going to check in the emails that I sent you to make sure there's nothing that we didn't go over, because I think you went over everything.
Well, there was one thing, and I have a thing about it here we can talk about, but we should maybe talk about questions first. But someone had asked about Paul the Deacon. And his presence at the court of Charlemagne, and whether I had anything to add to, or his comments about the origins of the Longobards, which is a mythological story. We could talk about that a little bit, but maybe a question.
Yeah, if there's anyone who has a live question. We didn't get a whole lot into Old English. There's more that could be said about Bede, for example, but I feel like that may even be a whole other topic.
Well, Bede, I would mention the two things in Bede that maybe people can read up on if they're interested in, is that Bede has in his account, he tells the story of a pagan priest named Coifi, who goes over from his pagan religion to Christianity, and he talks about his motivations. And this priest himself destroys a pagan shrine after he becomes Christian. So this is an example of something we don't have in the Continental Record, which is the words or the perspective of a pagan priest. We know that they're there. We have no conversations with them. We have no dialogue from their point of view. Now, I think that Bede's account is probably tendentious, but at least it's there. And the other thing is Bede gives a wonderful poetic reflection from the point of view of a pagan, someone about to convert to Christianity, where he's talking about what the new religion represents for him. There's a very famous story of this. It's called the Sparrow Parable. And your audience can look at that and see, this is a pagan saying, well, the new religion, life is short and it's over in no time. It's like a sparrow flying through the meat hall on a winter's day. He comes from the cold, he goes into the cold, life is over. It's really very tragic, but if the new religion can offer us more than that, then it's worth maybe exploring. And so that's what those are two little insights into the pagan mentality. as tendentious as they are, there's something, we don't have anything of the kind from Franconia or from Francia, so they're worth considering from that point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
All
these
right.
certainly probably are pretty tendentious.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Any questions there?
Yeah, anything live? Yeah, there's some questions about Easter and Easter month, although that's again more bead.
That's all minutia of bead in the Anglo-Saxon situation. I'm sorry, that question came earlier, but I just did not have time to explore that particular thing. I just draw upon Bede to the extent that he fills in gaps on the continental record, and I'm sorry I did not have time to look into that, nor do I have the expertise to really get involved in the minutia of the Anglo-Saxon theological discussions. Right? There's a lot of Easter is very, very important in the Anglo-Saxon context because the Irish have a whole different way of looking at Easter, and so you want to have a theory of Easter from Bede's point of view, because you've got to counter these Irish monks who have a different story of Easter. And Easter, of course, is the central feast day of the Christian calendar because it's when Christ rose again from the dead, right? And it's even more important than Christmas to a certain extent. Everybody's born, great, but not everybody rises from the dead. So Easter is the major Christian festival. So that's why Bede is so interested in Easter. I think I don't think there's anything quite similar to that in the continent.
Yeah, and I think it's also a reminder that so often the writers of this period might actually be a lot more concerned with heresy than with paganism, right? I mean, it's like heresy has, potentially like structure behind it, documents behind it, things like that. Paganism is just like, whatever. It's these old guys in the country still taking cash, right? But heresy is American Express, right? It's like
I love these. I love those metaphors. I'm gonna have to use that. I'm gonna work that into my. That's great.
Just came to me today. I was just like,
that's
kind of what this is, right? I mean, it reminds me of the mechanic who's like, "Oh, can you pay me in cash?" God, man.
All right. So no questions. Let me address the listener who wrote and wanting to know about Paul the Deacon and his account of the Longobards. So Paul the Deacon, in his History of the Longobards, Paul the Deacon is himself a Longobard cleric who comes to Charlemagne's court in the late 8th century and is one of Charlemagne's big intellectual team that he assembles there with Alcuin and Theodulf from Spain and Paul the Deacon. And, these are the people who really get the so-called Carolingian Renaissance underway, this Renaissance of learning and letters that happens under Charlemagne. Paul the Deacon is one of the big players there. Well, he wrote a history of the Longobards, and it starts out with this very interesting account about how the Longobards got their name. And he tells the story of how Woden, it's called Godon, I think, and Freya, right? Woden and Freya are appealed to each by different barbarian tribes. I think Odin is appealed to by the Vandals at the time, who are way up there, and the Longobards come to Freya and want her on his side, and they want Freya to decide the battle for them. And so Freya, she tells the Longobards, and especially their women, to and Odin's going to award the victory to, I think, whoever he sees in the morning.
I think that's right. And he uses masculine pronouns. It's like istos, right?
Yeah. So Freya tells the Longobardic women to bring their long hair forward and to make it look like beards, and show up on the at the first light of dawn. And then Odin and Freya wake up, and Freya points Odin in the direction of the Longobardic women, and he says, "Who are these long beards?" Right? And she says something like, "Well, you've named them, now own them," right? And give them the victory. And he's like, "All right, fine." And he gives them the victory, and they triumph over the Vandals. And that's like the origin moment, the coming into being of this people under their name, the long beards. It's obviously a mythological account. But it's a story that we have nowhere else. So it probably goes back to some sort of tradition that will have been talked about in the among the Longobards. Now, the context here is is that, and this returns us to the beginning here. So all these Germanic peoples want to convert to Christianity. Well, another aspect of their Romanization is they all want to have their origin story.
Yeah.
Like the Romans did, right? The Romans had an origin story, very famous one, where they come from Troy, right? And they were favored by the gods, by Venus, right? And Aeneas and Venus. And they fled to Italy and they set up their great kingdom. Well, it's an origin story from destruction and divine favor and things like that. So all the Germanic peoples are like, okay, we want to become Roman too. We need our own individual Roman origin stories. And so all the Germanic peoples get somebody to write their origin story. And Paul the Deacon is writing the origin of the Longobards. There's one for the Goths, right, written by Jordanes, called Getica, the origins of the Goths. And there's a little bit of, among the first ancestors of the Goths, there are a couple characters who might be mythological. There's a certain Gaut or Gapt figure who might be an Odin character, right? Adrian mentioned Fredegar. Fredegar has a story of the Franks. Now, the Franks have a different origin story. The Franks borrow the Roman origin story. The Franks say, yeah, we too come from Troy. We were refugees from Troy as well. And they kind of fiddle with the sons of Priam or something like that, and figure out how to insert the Franks in there somewhere. So the Franks don't derive their ancestry from the Germanic gods, but rather from the Roman gods. Maybe that shows an especially close relationship to the Romans there. That's a possibility. There is the story in Bede of the origins of from Hengist and Horsa, right? These mythological horse gods of some kind. And some of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you do find Odin back there in the early family trees of some of the gods there too. So, but this is also part of becoming Roman, is having a respectable national history, having
Right.
respect. Yeah. So that's simply another way in which these Germanic tribes wanted to elevate themselves to the level of what Rome had and what Rome was.
You
And
know,
another thing, one last comment, and then please go. And all of these gentilic stories, Gentile means of the people, right? All these gentilic stories do fit into the grand sweep of history in which the Romans play a role. And then the creation stories from the Bible are put in there too. So it's not like the barbarians are saying, no, we come from someplace completely different. We do come from that completely different place, but then we join up with the course of Roman history and of world history then in these accounts.
right. I'm going to throw one of my patented awful analogies in here. I was thinking about so this is a pet peeve of mine, right? I feel like so much of sort of rural America is undergoing a certain amount of Texanification, where it's like we've got to import sort of Texas and Texas stuff. I feel like Texas is becoming like the rural America to identify with. And so you hear people all over rural America sounding more Texan. Country music sounds more Texan. But I also feel like there's this like bravado and also like state flag thing. Texans are really big about, the Lone Star flag. And so you start seeing like more and more of like whatever local state flag like showing up on stuff in a way that you really never used to see in Colorado
Interesting.
or whatever. Yeah. And I kind of feel like to a certain extent you're seeing, not to the same intensity and not with the same probably grand political implications, although maybe something like that Romanification where it's like, oh, well, we've got to have sort of what the Texans have, right?
Yeah.
Just a pet peeve of mine.
Adrian points out something that I did need to mention, which is that there is one little bit of mythology, Germanic mythology, perhaps associated with the Merovingian dynasty. It's in Fredegar, and he says there's an account there where the one of the early Frankish kings, he's visiting someplace, and his wife goes to a body of water, and she's seduced by a sea monster, a so-called Adrian mentions it's called a Quinotaur. So there is a sense in which the Frankish kings do descend from a mythological being of some kind, right? And it's this sea monster, right? They don't have a Germanic god there because they've already made the choice to come from Troy, right. But they do kind of get a mythological being into the family tree in that account there. So that's a cute little story.
It's so weird. And I mean, it really speaks to the fact that they are ready to jettison this original cultural heritage pretty
Yeah,
fast, right? Because there's no power associated with it. There's no status associated with it. The other people who do it are all like behind us, right? It's like,
right.
oh, we don't want to be associated with these people anymore.
And Koifi in Bede's account, that priest, makes that very point that you just made. He's like, I've served the gods my whole life. What have they got me? I'm low status now.
Yeah.
You know, and if I become if I join this new religion, then I gain in status. So that's exactly the point that Koifi made in that text. Again, tangentious, right? Bede is writing centuries after, or not centuries, but decades after that event happened. But I don't know, maybe something is retained there.
Yeah.
That's based on,
Some truth to the social anxiety.
yeah, yeah.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion, and you've taken a lot of time with us and spent a lot of time preparing this material for us. Um, Again, I've posted that link a couple times into the chat for folks to look at. This is a rich source of material here. And if I can't get this up on YouTube soon, I will post it unedited on Vimeo soon, just to make sure Patreon can see it to refer back to the discussion. Would you
Glad
say?
to do it, and we can cover those those other topics by and by at some point.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. I mean, like we've got to talk about the Nibelungen at least, right? I mean, that's
I'm teaching the Nibelungen next semester, so I'm refreshing all that material anyway. So we can talk about that.
cool.
Definitely.
Cool. Sounds great to me. Alex, always a pleasure. And I'll look forward to
Mutual.
next time. And
Thanks everybody for joining in and
yeah,
for giving great comments. Hello, Adrian and others. And
actually, hold on. I'll grab a hat as a seer, and I'll wish everybody all the best.